So welcome everybody to our session today on developing your clinical informatics team. I am Anne-Marie Cunningham. I'm Vice Chair of Council in the Faculty of Clinical Informatics. I've been that for a few years now, and I'm also our professionalism lead. So I chair the Professionalism Standing Committee, and this piece of work came out of our standing committee and previous work that we've done. So we've just published very recently our clinical informatics team report, which I think we'll put a link in on the side for you. And we've got a panel today, a brilliant panel of people that mostly contributed to it, but not everybody did. And they bring in really fresh perspectives as well. Jodi, and we're delighted to have you along today. So we'll run through the agenda and so you know what's going to happen during the next hour. So we'll start off by giving our panel members a chance to introduce themselves, and fantastic to have them along, and thank you for all of you for coming and attending. We've got 55 people already in the session, and I'm sure we'll have more probably joining as we're going along. And thank you so much for coming along. Remember, this is an evolving and continually evolving piece of work, and one of the things we'll be saying at the end is about what we're doing next and how we would like you to get further involved in it, because it's a really live issue for us looking at the clinical informatics teams. We'll have the introductions, then I'll run through how we actually got to this report and what the key findings are, and then we'll move on to a panel discussion where our 4 panelists will give us what this report means to them and how they're, what they're taking from it and how it relates to what they've been doing. And then moving on to a Q&A, so we get to hear from you. So please do keep putting your questions in the chat. I will pick up on questions there and pick those up at the end. So without further ado, let me go on and welcome our team. And I'm going to ask them to speak and say hello in the order that they're going to be speaking later. So can Ramandeep say hello?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. Hope everyone's well. I'm Ramandeep Kaur. I'm the Chief Clinical Information Officer for University Hospitals of Northamptonshire. I'll hand over to Stephen.
Hi, I'm Steve Bagley, Clinical Director of eHealth in Grampian. I was on the preparation group for this. Very interesting discussions. Look forward to getting your comments later.
And then Basil?
Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. We've got a really good turnout today. I am a consultant pediatric surgeon. I do not work at Leeds now, but my clinical role in informatics is within Sheffield Children's NHS Trust, and I'm principally the CSO for that group, safety officer. But I also am part of the informatics team and was part of writing the report.
Super. And Jodi, and a special welcome to Jodi, in because she was nobbled when she turned up at we've got new members through with Fed IP 35 under 35. So Jodi hadn't participated in this in the development of this, but especially big welcome to you for joining the panel. Can you say hello?
Thank you. Hi. So my name is Jodi Allen Barrett. So I'm the digital lead nurse for the Care Information Exchange, and I also lead on the remote patient monitoring hub at Imperial. Thank you.
Fantastic. So I am going to run through now how we went about doing this piece of work. So it's, if you remember, we did one of the first things the faculty did was develop its core competency framework. And the next thing, one of the next big things that we did then was look and work on job description for a CCIO coming out of the core competency framework. So using that, because we knew that the quality of job descriptions for CCIOs and things around it was really not very good. So several of the people that are here had actually worked on that. And then we were then thinking, what's going to be our next stage? And at that time, there was talk about, say, the office of the CCIO and thinking about it that way. And we said, well, rather than go off and do lots more job descriptions and things, let's see what the lie of the land is like and how people work together and who's in these clinical informatics teams and what kind of functions do they do and what actually makes it successful in being a team. So can you go on to the next slide, Ruda? Yeah. So we went out and we had this idea then, we want to go out and find out about these. And we tested out some of the language. We quickly realised Office of the CIO wasn't really going to fly with a lot of people. That didn't really feel like it wasn't the way that things were set up. Not everybody reported to the Office of the CIO or had that kind of, so we decided from some of our initial, say, discovery, but the sessions that we worked at and with some of the digital health seminars, etc., that it was a good idea to move it more to thinking about it as being the clinical informatics team and the group of people that were working together, maybe not in one place or managed by one person, but working together across an organisation. So we asked people to go and tell us about the people working in our organisation and how it was. And so we had a, not quite like a survey, but a form to fill in to tell us about that. And we had a number of recipients to that. And then we asked people if we could speak to them in more depth, and we gained an awful lot from that. So our team spoke in depth to people in teams across England, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And all along that was complemented by roundtable discussions from a multi-profession working group, which was made up of people that had been, some people had been on the Professional Incident Standing Committee and other people that stepped in and got involved in that. And I can tell you, the discussions in there were quite robust, and we talked through lots of different elements of this and gained a lot from that process. And through that, we came up with, the way I say about this is, this was done by talking to real people. So there's not much jargon in here, because real people that are doing the job don't use that much jargon. So the things and the way they describe what they're doing and what it means. So we've got these rules which are, and I hope that you will read this and think, yes, that's articulating what I know I have, or what I know I want to have, if you haven't got this in place already. But the clinical informatics teams are acting as a translator between the IT or the tech staff or other digital staff and the clinical staff. They're identifying and helping to resolve issues. Somebody said, I think it was a friend of Jan, said they're kind of like the fixers and the facilitators across the organisation of making sure that you're able to get things done. They think about how you can do the work better. And not everybody in the clinical informatics team does their clinical work still, but they're very, very close relationships with the clinicians. They really understand what they're doing. And that means that they can spot different ways of working alongside their colleagues. They're often involved in training and making sure that the training is appropriate and coordinating it, and they will have responsibility for clinical safety. So being the clinical safety officer, working with others, and everybody usually that works within the clinical informatics team has a responsibility for safety, isn't it? We all know it's like cybersecurity in all the areas. You don't get clinical safety because one person is responsible for it. It's everybody's job, but particularly the clinical informaticians are there. So what makes for successful team development? Well, as we know, having a multi-professional team, having it engage with the wider workforce, delivery of the key functions required by the organisation, so identifying and thinking what is it that's particularly pertinent for us at this time and making sure that you've got the right people in place to be able to do it, making opportunities to have shared learning and discussion, thinking about all the individuals in the team and what their personal development of skills needs to be within informatics, then very closely integrating the clinicians and the clinical informatics team with the wider digital team, and making sure that there is representation at board level. Now, in the past, it's been stated the CIO should be a board level person, a board level. We know that is very rare to have a clinical informatician at board level, but the clinical informatician team should be able to be providing levels of advice to the board, and at that level of seniority that they're taking, and they have a voice that they're able to translate over. And when we're going to go on to the next slide.
Just to say, Anne-Marie, we've had a couple of questions.
Okay.
So William Bryant has said, can a clinical informatics team be involved in developing and deploying informatics, analytics, clinical decision support?
Absolutely,
and
William, they can be. And you would expect if you're doing any work of analytics, clinical decision support, that you would have clinical informaticians involved in that work. Some organisations may not be at that might not be where they're at, or they might be using the team in different ways. But absolutely, they could be involved in doing data-driven innovation.
And we have one more from our chair. Do the CI teams also do a sort of translation for patients?
I'm going to leave that actually up to the panel to sort of say, but I think that we're thanks for that question, Jonathan, our chair. I wouldn't. My experience and my thoughts about it is that you wouldn't be bringing the clinical informatics team to explain clinical informatics to one-to-one to patients, but probably as part of the clinical informatics teams, you may be thinking, how do we get how do we have user-centered design if you're doing things that are patient-facing in there? But maybe that is something that the panel can think about whenever they're actually speaking and responding. So going back to, we've sort of said, like, there's the good things. So what are the challenges whenever you're having your clinical informatics team? Well, lo and behold, not be a surprise to anybody, the lack of funding. So you maybe can't grow your team as you want to do. You're not able to get them resourced to have the time that they need to do it. Not if you have got your team disconnected from the board level engagement. If they're working over, you know, and not having that level, that can be very challenging. The temporary nature of informatics roles. So there's, as we know, like public digital, the Tom Lewis-Moore and all, I've often said fund teams, not projects. If you make your clinical informatics team being funded by projects and working a specific implementation, the job disappears, you've lost a lot of your skill and your expertise. So where you're actually able to get core teams, you have a lot of benefit. And some have had difficulty in recruiting because of these other elements. For example, it's only as a comment, etc., and you're not going into a core job. So let's just, yeah, thanks for people answering questions in the side. I see Claire's got a question in there as well about we change user acceptance. And I'm going to leave, at the moment, I'm going to leave those questions at the side until we've actually heard from our panel and see what they're saying, because I'm telling you, if what I've said's probably generated a lot of questions, there'll be even more once they start talking. So we might have to just answer the questions as we're going through in the chat, and I'll not delay that much any further. But just to say, what's the brief? What do we ask? What do we say to the panel that we'd like them to kind of cover off? But they don't have to, you know, we're not keeping tabs or marking them out of 10 or anything here. But we'd sort of said we'd like to hear a little bit about, from their perspective, about the local clinical team development. What aspects of the report really resonated with them and their experience of their local practice around there, and what they will take away from the report and use to develop their team. And some of them want to be focusing more or less on different elements of that. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ramandeep to get the party started.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. I'm not sure about you scoring me out of 10.
Yeah, that's what I said. No scores out of 10.
That's fine. I'm only joking. So thank you very much, firstly, to the FCI for allowing me to be part of this great panel discussion and also part of the roundtables for this report. I've been involved in a number of the working streams now with the FCI, including the CCIO JD and other pieces of work. So it's great to be on board. So I'm actually going to kick off and ask you all to consider this question. And in the festive spirit, I'm going to ask you to imagine you've got a Christmas wish list. What one thing would you ask for right now to build a clinical informatics team in your trust? If there was something you really had to ask for, what would that be? I'm going to give you all a moment for reflection and perhaps something we can come back to in the Q&A. And Anne-Marie's very nicely started us off. So hopefully everyone's got an answer to that. And the reason for asking that question is because we've got lots of people on the call. We'll have lots of people here from different organisations, different roles across different sectors, hopefully. Therefore, what makes a difference to you today won't necessarily be the same as the person who's sat next to you virtually. However, to add up all those requirements together, hopefully they'll form the ingredients for a recipe for success, the fundamentals of which is in the report. So you're probably all thinking, where am I going? I've talked about Christmas and I've talked about baking already, and we're only 2 minutes in. So why have I asked you that question? And that's because I've been asking myself that same question since I started my new role in July. What's important to me? What's important to the staff at Kettering and Northampton hospitals where I work? And what's important for our patients? So we build these teams, what actually matters to them as well. What's on my Christmas wish list? So a little bit of context. So at University Hospitals of Northamptonshire, we have a CCIO team made up of myself, who's the group CCIO, 4 CCIOs who are consultants and do 2 PAs each a week, 0.6 of a whole-time equivalent of a CSO, a fixed-term EPMA lead nurse, a seconded remote monitoring nurse. So that's the team, and we've got currently 1 digital midwife funded by maternity, and I'm going to let you think about that for a moment too. So for full transparency, we're carrying a number of vacancies, and this is where this report's essential to me. So thinking about point 2 and the panel discussion, I'm at the really beginning of a journey for building a team. We've got a hybrid approach of paper and electronic. We're in the process of procuring an EPR on one site and a modular build on another. So as I was at the underground this morning and I hurried through, I thought about this report, what I was going to say today and what's my opinions. So for me, developing a clinical informatics team is a bit like the underground, you know, perhaps contentious, but there's lots of different destinations, so lots of projects with lots of people behind the scenes and on the front line running that service. So something I've always been fascinated by, but haven't taken a career with Transport for London. Instead in healthcare. So what's the striking part of the report for me is the variation in the teams that make up across those 14 different organisations that were interviewed, and how the organisational size doesn't necessarily reflect the size of the team. So in my personal opinion, the report lays the foundations for building a successful team in health and social care. A report which I can share with senior hospital management teams and the trust execs, because what I really want to do is bring the individuals in my organisations on this journey with me, that digital is just as important as the work which is undertaken in our clinical divisions. So going back to my wish list and thinking about how I'm going to use this report to develop a clinical informatics team, which is the point that I can really talk about because that's something that's really close to my heart. My goal is to build a fantastic team of clinical and non-clinical staff, and I'm not here to recruit people, but if anyone wishes to join us, you're welcome to join, and who can work together to implement and optimise digital systems and processes within Northamptonshire. So for me, critically, that team needs to be recognised within the organisation as a digital force. And I know there's lots of things out there. People call themselves the digital warriors, the digital angels. I've seen lots of things on Twitter. So undoubtedly, to achieve this, one of the things that I definitely need is some money. And I'll be honest, I don't have all the money I'd quite like right now in order to build a team. So the plan is to use some money from an EPR business case that we're putting together. And I know Anne-Marie talked about projects a moment ago and how we kind of fund things through projects and then what do we do next. But the plan is to build a team of multidisciplinary professional staff. And there's a hot topic of contention this morning on Twitter from the Digital Health Network CCIO Network takeover by one of my fellow co-chairs of the advisory panel, Aisha, around should those roles be split between digital and clinical? And that's something that actually resonates with me quite a lot. So as a pharmacist myself, my plan would be that the team would be a mixture of doctors, nurses, midwives, AHPs, pharmacists, pharmacy technicians, healthcare scientists to drive clinical informatics. And someone talked about non-clinical staff too. And in addition to the clinical staff that I've spoken about, within this dream team that I've got on my Christmas wish list, I'm hoping that I can build some staff who have got an understanding of operations, administration activities that go on the ground. So our ward clerks who have got lots of experience, all our RTTs, all the recording, etc., clinical coding. So building a team of people who have got different expertise, that analyst expertise, but also understanding of patients, so perhaps a patient volunteer. So I recognise that a lot of what I've said is perhaps a really tall order, but the ambition is to create initially is to review some fixed term and seconded posts, most definitely, because we don't have that financial input there. for a full team who could be in as business as usual, but that's then something to consider. What do we need moving forward? Where's the innovation? Where's the posts also that are going to drive innovation and not just keep the lights on? So a lot for me to consider. I know I don't have all the answers today, but the report is really exciting for me to see how I can use that report, network with my colleagues across the board and build a successful team for the future. Thank you, and I'm now going to hand back over to Anne-Marie.
Shall I pick it up from here, actually?
Oh, I'll hand over to you, Stephen, then.
Sorry, I thought that you were handing over to Steve. Sorry, that's what you'd said. Sorry, Ramandeep, sorry about that.
That's okay. Apologies.
Okay, so I'm up next to talk about our team. Emma, have you got the that slide you can put up there? And the reason I want to show you this diagram is I think it brings out some of the learning that certainly I gained from taking part in this development group, which was that a team isn't necessarily a hierarchy in the sense that we perhaps came into the group thinking of it, the office of the CCIO, or a kind of tight hierarchy where everyone is managed by somebody all under the same umbrella. I think the reality, and hopefully this diagram will appear in a moment, which I spent minutes creating, that the reality is that clinicians involved in healthcare IT in an organization are often in very different parts of that organization. And so what we need to do to be successful, if we're measuring success by delivering good stuff and deciding together what we're going to do, and then delivering that stuff, to be successful, we have to work together and horizontally in an organization, and that of course includes community contractors such as pharmacists, optometrists, dentists, and GPs. So not necessarily within the bounds of the kind of the state-run health organization. So I think in terms of the history of our team, it's clearly never had a starting point. As the clinical lead for labs IT tells me, there was a labs IT decades before there was an e-health department, and I'm sure that's the case in every hospital or health organization. But we've got an e-health department, and we've got which does some of the work. I keep on stressing we don't do all of the work, and there's multiple other departments involved in healthcare IT, such as labs, radiology, medical equipment, and there are multiple clinical leads for systems which aren't necessarily directly managed by the e-health department. But some of the development work that we've done in recent years have been to employ more clinicians to help with the hospital-based EPR, which we loosely call Track World, Track Care and Associated Systems, clinical change agents, and a digital nurse for the wards implementation. Now, AHPs looking at this will say, well, there's no AHPs on that diagram. AHPs are involved, but I have to fess up, there isn't a digital lead for AHPs, although AHP perspectives are taken in. But I think one of the things to highlight in this is that little box in the bottom left, which is that this doesn't cover the experience, qualifications, and time allowance, which are hugely varied. And that's another thing I got from this report, that that's a common situation, that many people don't have formal qualifications in this area. Opportunities aren't always there, although they are improving, and we need to take that into account as we progress. Other things that resonated with me are the marketing element, the kind of sociology of this. If a team isn't a hierarchy, then it makes it even more important that how we market the people as a team, as a collective group working to common goals. That's even more important than it would be if we were in the office of the CCIO, for example. A few sort of takeaways from me in terms of areas that we could improve locally. Greater clarity of the roles, both within ourselves and as we expose that to our 15,000 or so members of staff. I like the concept of the digital cabinet, the idea of just all comers come in and you sort of talk about what's going on. We have the approach using Teams is perhaps a way of achieving that without getting hundreds of people into a room together. You can have an asynchronous discussion about what's important to people, and we've started to do some work on that. And I think the Rowandeep point around this is now a thing you can share. You can hold this up virtually and say to the exec teams, this is what is recommended. These seven ingredients for success are a really digestible list that you can take to anybody in the organization and say, look, this is what is needed if we're going to make real progress in this area for the benefit of care quality improvements, benefiting staff, patients, and the bottom line as well. So hand on to Basil now.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. That's a lovely summary. Yes, and yeah, please have Basil.
Thank you very much.
Can we go back to our slide with the questions, Ruda?
I'm going to start with sort of what I took with the report. My organisation was actually one of the case studies. Big secret, it's not public, we follow it, but we contributed to the structure as well as me being involved in sort of part of the thinking around how it's written by mainly Stephen and Marie, I think, in the end. I think the take home from the report for me was that it's a set of principles, and as Anne-Marie said, this is a work in progress, and if we're all honest, nobody particularly knows the best way to do all of this. So it's not a rigid structure, and it is something that's going to evolve, and I think that's quite important for informatics because it's a new thing, and naturally it's going to change. And like many new medical interventions, care interventions, and techniques, these things change with time. They go from being new and exciting to routine and mundane. And I think if you're too rigid in how you apply some of these ideas, you'll get stuck into sort of a very rigid structure, which means your team cannot be flexible and develop as things change. And I think, as you alluded to, not all of your team are part of your informatics team. And we've certainly been going out to look for all those other parts of the organisation which do informatics and have done for a long time, and try to bring them into the fold, or at least bring their input and then take the best contributions for the general work in the organisation as a whole as we move forward. So I think that's quite important to get people on board and to avoid duplicating the work within your organisation. And that then means you have a kind of a group of people you can pick the best of to do other things when you move on to new projects. So in terms of the organisation I'm from, Sheffield Children's NHS Foundation Trust is a specialist children's organisation, which means it's relatively small, the size of a small or medium DGH according to NHS England. And it's also quite niche because we just do paediatrics. But we also cover quite a wide scope of things, which may be unusual compared to some other trusts of a similar size. We cover mental health for children. Got a bit of feedback where that's coming from. Someone's not muted. We cover mental health. We cover the regional children's and neonatal transport service. We have a community-based service, and we also have the local and the regional secondary and tertiary care services in the South Yorkshire and Sheffield, which is quite a lot of things to do. And I think a lot of organisations will actually understand that. The focus often is on big organisations, big teaching hospitals, and large regional organisations in other sectors. But actually, most people trying to develop teams are relatively small, and yet they have to do exactly the same work. And I think it's most noticeable in things like clinical safety. Anytime you introduce a new product, it doesn't matter how big your organisation is, the same product means the same work, and often you don't have enough people or time to perhaps do the level of testing and checking that you might like to do. And I think that needs to be reflected in how we look for funding and who we put in our teams, and also how agile we are in our testing approach, and just informatics in general. The other thing that I sort of like to flag in terms of how do we apply the findings in the report or the recommendation is that the majority of people tend to try to cater to the majority. And I'm naturally going to tell you, well, I'm not one of the majority, and therefore come and look at me, come and do stuff with us, because children are not the majority. And a lot of you will also work in organisations that are not the focus of big efforts, large-scale funding and developments with informatics. The 80-20 principle tends to get applied. And actually, you might want to think about whether going to those people in the 20% might be more fruitful. From a sort of health and care perspective, those niches include people that have to handle the same generic activities as everybody else, but they also have experience you can draw upon in your teams, and it's quite hard to represent everybody. So I think, again, as Steve, you were saying, you can't necessarily have somebody from each professional background, and perhaps that doesn't matter within a team. It doesn't really matter what your clinical or professional background is within the team, so long as you're prepared to deal with other professional groups and bring in expertise as you need. Trying to create a specific informatics role for everybody in every single discipline will never cater for everyone. And I think there's a lot to be had from going out to those that are in non-traditional informatics professions or specialisms, and for those niches within care and health practice that are considered niche and not mainstream. And then the final point, I guess, which the report kind of prompted to me, and certainly we've experienced in our team, is that there are some uncomfortable areas you have to talk about when we talk about teams. And unfortunately, it boils down to contracts, to money, to roles and reward and that sort of thing. So there is clearly a dynamic between those of us on medical contracts like me and those of us who are on a gender change contract, which is pretty much everybody else. And I think it's important to talk about that. Are we being paid the same for equal work? And if we're not, is that causing tensions that we don't really talk about? We've not come across that directly, but I can feel that sort of potential bubbling around, particularly when you've got a very experienced, let's say an AHP or a nurse working with a relatively inexperienced doctor who's come onto an informatics team. And you can see that there's a disparity, and you see the same disparity in terms of the time within a contract that's allocated. The second one about contracts is they're not often very flexible. You can't move freely between your clinical role and your informatics role. And I've been advocating now at our trust that we need to develop ways of working, whether that's job plans for medical consultants or just contract arrangements for others, where you don't have to spend the same fraction of your working day in your informatics or clinical, that there is some ability to go back and forth as required by your personal professional needs to maintain the strength of your clinical input and your organizational needs for the informatics team to grow and shrink as projects come and go. And then finally, I think the other aspect which does need to be is that sort of the building of silos within your informatics team that mirror the management silos. Again, that sort of, we have to have a chief nurse, we have to have a chief AHP, we have to have, if you're truly inclusive, if you listen to all people, if you flatten that hierarchy, which I think is generally advocated for in the report and by the FCI as an organization, the way it works, you may not need to have direct representation, and you may therefore end up potentially and possibly controversially with a more flexible team. And that's perhaps something people might like to challenge me on or pick up in the Q&A. And then I'll hand on to Ellie.
Fantastic. Thank you, Basil. And let's go on to Jodi Allen. So thank you so much for your observations there. Jodi Allen, I'll hand over to you.
Hi, thanks, Anne-Marie. So from my point of view, I've been quite lucky in the organisation that I've come into. We do have like a very good clinical informatics team with a variety. So we have an established CNIO and a CCIO who work really closely together. I sit under the CNIO's post, and we feed into, so he feeds into both the chief nurse of the hospital as well as the CIO. So we have that oversight both within the nursing clinical aspects and within the IT. And actually, all of the digital nurses within our teams, they actually sit within the IT department rather than within the nursing corporate side. So I think that aspect of it, we then truly are that bridge between what the nursing and the clinical environments need and speaking with the technical team. So like for myself, I lead on the technical sides of the virtual hospital that we have. And I act as that bridge between the clinical teams with the new pathways that we bring out and the technical teams in terms of what we can actually do using technology and how we can get the best out of the information that we're getting from the patients to present that back via like the patient portals, for example. So as a result of that, so I have close working relationships with like our business intelligence team. We work closely with like the analyst configurers and the reporting teams to be able to use the data that we're getting from patients and present it both within the clinical areas to say these are the informations that we're getting from your patients and how we can use that for auditing and reporting purposes, but also to use the informatics that we're getting to help patients to identify how they can help themselves. I think that's the aspects of it that we focus on quite a lot within our areas. So we also have like close working relationships with our digital transformation and programs and projects team. And within those teams, they actually do have nurses and like midwives and AHPs and such. And I think the variety as well as non-clinical, and I think that variety and everyone's experiences from different backgrounds makes for such like a good working environment when it comes to clinical informatics. In terms of like the aspects of the report that resonate with me. So I think one of the key bits was being about being the translator between the IT departments and the clinical staff, because I think that bit can make the difference between the program or project or anything that you're doing being successful or not. Having someone who understands what it is that you want as a clinician makes such a difference, and then having that person being part of the IT team or the clinical informatics team, actually you're then able to speak the same language, or even if you're not from the same department or area, you have similar understandings of like the key bits that you're trying to get across, which just makes such a difference. And as a result, it then means that you're improving the ways that you're working, both within everything really. So the key factors for me in terms of that I would take from the report would be about like the shared learning and the discussions, because what works well for one area won't necessarily work well for another, but there are aspects of what you've learned within the different areas that you could still apply, or say that aspect of it doesn't work, but we can change it slightly to make it work for us. And it's just thinking outside the box, really. Yeah.
Oh, lovely insights, Jodi, and thank you so much for that. Sometimes whenever you're like deep in the, into the weeds of actually working on something, you don't, and it's lovely to get your fresh perspective on it. And thank you so much for sharing that. The other person I actually meant to really thank, because I don't think he's on the session, was Doug Stewart, who chaired the working group who was doing this and gave a great contribution to it as well. And I think we'll try and plan to do a special kind of follow-up, maybe with Stirring the Borders, looking just at their experiences there, because I think we'd all love to know a bit more about what they get up to there with other people. One of the things I want to mention that kind of struck me from this report was actually the variation in the numbers. Now, we were small, there were small numbers that were actually feeding back into this, but we had a variation between, I think, about 0.2 whole-time equivalent in a team and about either 13 or 15. So it's like it's 60 times as many resource in one organisation as in another. And that's very hard to explain. It wasn't related to the size of organisations or anything like that. And I think it is one of those situations where, the future is already here. It's not just evenly distributed. We have some organisations that really have done this investment, that are moving ahead, that as Joe Rafferty was speaking last week from Merseycare at Clinical Informatics Congress in Leeds, and he was saying that boards can feel that investment in digital is risky and expensive. And I think one of the answers and one of the things that we want to be able to get across is that if you've invested in your clinical informatics team, you are de-risking that investment, because you are much more likely to get far more bang for your buck out of what you've done. You'll avoid expensive mistakes. You will have a lot of things with your EPR implementation and other things will be reduced. And if you haven't invested in that team yet, and you need some justification, come and look at this report to be able to get going. So at this stage, I want to move on now to taking some more questions from you and from the audience in the chat. Rup, I think we've been answering some questions as we've been going along. Does anybody want to ask a question? I'm actually going to let you, Rupa, are there any questions I've missed that we think we should answer now?
There's an interesting one that's been discussed about having a director that's responsible for both informatics and digital. And I don't know if any of the panel want to think.
Yeah, that's a good one, because I think that idea of the board level, and sometimes, where do these relationships fit? So if you don't have a CCIO at the board level, do you maybe have a CIO or the person at board level responsible? And how then are the relationships between the clinical informatics team, who may have professional responsibilities up to professional relationships like the CNIO or somebody, the digital lead nurse reporting to the CNO, but also having a relationship with the CIO. So can any of you, the panelists, maybe tell us about what you found or how that works in your organisation? Steve?
I mean, just one thought on it. A lot of this comes down to definitions, doesn't it? I mean, clearly the person asking the question sees informatics and digital as being different, but maybe informatics is about the management of acquisition and management of health data, but you're not going to get that unless you've got rock solid infrastructure and equipment and processes and all the rest. So as I see it, ideally it would be a combined role, but with an understanding within the team of all relevant aspects, you know, the learning healthcare system and the underlying infrastructure that makes it all possible.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Anne-Marie, I'm happy to come in on that.
Yeah, Ramandeep.
Yeah, really briefly. So I don't sit on the board, and I'll be honest, I don't think it quite bothers me just yet. Maybe that's because I'm really new into the role, but actually our CDIO does, and that's absolutely fine. And I'd like to think that I'm able to feed into that work stream and that voice and that I require, that information is voiced at that level. So for me, that's really what's important. And actually all the things that I described earlier, for me, it's about building those nuggets of information together, having all that training in place, giving back to the people, bringing people together so that actually that voice then can be aired at that level. So for me, and I agree with Stephen around how things are worded, for me, I've kind of never seen them separate. I've always seen them together too. And we actually call it digital within our organisation as opposed to splitting the different things. And maybe someone will tell me in a few years' time that, you know, I shouldn't have said this a few years back and should have thought I should have been at board level, but it doesn't faze me right now.
Yeah. Did anybody else want to come in on that?
I mean, I guess, can I come in now?
Yes, Basil,
if my CCIO isn't at board level, I certainly don't sit at board level. Our CIO does. And I suppose one of the things that you do notice is perhaps you don't want to have executive responsibility within your organisation as a whole as an informatician. And that may not be a bad thing, provided that your board listen to you and that you have good communication with them about what's needed and you can give advice and get things back from them. I think it's on a lesser level. The same thing happens with clinical safety work. Someone's asked about CSO work and feeling a bit lost, and you're not on your own, because most CSOs I've talked to, and certainly when I started only a couple of years ago doing that work, do feel somewhat lost. And there is a tension between what you're expected to do and your actual responsibilities, which I think applies as much to a CCIO being on the board or not being on the board as a CSO taking responsibility. And I think there is an area within our CSO work in the FDI about making it clear where the line sits between accountability, responsibility, and then giving advice. So I think it's important to be clear on that. One of the things that CSOs aren't very clear on when I talk to them, and I certainly was not, is indemnity in your professional organisation for making decisions or recommendations. And that clear distinction as a CSO, say, of giving advice versus making a decision at the executive level, which I think you should be mindful of when you take on a role, whether you're on board or not, and whether you choose to pursue a position on the board. And as I said, provided you're being listened to, your organisation has a health culture, you probably don't need to be on the board as an absolute requirement for doing good work in informatics.
Yeah, I think the question was specifically about, about the idea of how then, where you have got your board level representation, which, as we said, we know that's very rarely a CCI from a clinical point of view. There is, I can think of Gloucestershire ICS, which has appointed Paul Atkinson, one of our fellows, and a GP and a clinical informatician as their CCIO, as a board level position, and he manages the whole digital team. So the whole digital team and IT team report into the CCIO. Very unusual, but you have to make it work across whatever way you have those relationships, so your relationship with the CCIO or whoever has that board level bit. And sometimes I suppose we can think about it like, oh, well, it doesn't really matter as long as we're all talking together, working as a team, we've got that flat hierarchy, we're working there as a network, we've got good relationships. But I guess the times that people want to bounce back to saying, well, it is important that we're together and we've got that, and you can see that people in the chat are talking about being the poor relationist. Where does the money come from? So if you're in a distributed team, how do you manage to keep the money kind of flowing and the resource and the time and the protection to be able to get on and to do your work, that kind of, so that's, I think, the tension between, we absolutely have to work with what you've got now, don't we? We have to work with what we've got now. It's how do we move on? So Steve, coming back on that.
One coming linked in with that is remembering the times we circled repeatedly in the group about
Yes.
names and definitions for things, and concluded that, as it says in the paper, it's more about functions or activities than it is about, you know, the title the person has on the door of their office, if they ever had an office. So I think it's very hard to avoid, though, talking about titles and roles, isn't it? But I think there's a risk we become preoccupied with that rather than actually what are people doing, and are they talking to each other?
Yes, absolutely. Okay, any other questions that are coming through?
One of the other questions that's come through quite a lot is the interaction between sort of clinicians and clinical informaticians and data that's been churned out through these organisations. So I don't know if any of the panel have.
So
I thought.
Thank you. The way that the question is coming up is that because there's been a lot of chat going on about that, about the information teams. So how do often in organisations, you've got the information team split off from actually the digital team or the IT team, the people that actually manage like infrastructure and the software, which maybe generates the information. So they've got a separate, and there's a bit about the commonality of actually having them reporting to the same person rather than different. So that was one of the questions about that. And then you've got the clinicians as well, and how do the clinical informaticians possibly sit with data and information, as well as sitting with the people doing the IT and the kind of infrastructural elements and looking after the software. So can any of our panel any experience of that, of how you manage those relationships with the information team as well? Dave?
No, I don't think we're doing it as well as we could, to be frank. I mean, I think what I didn't mention in my sort of groupogram is the academic side. We're a teaching hospital. We've got a health data research unit. The people in that have some connections with the NHS side of things. We've got a health intelligence group within NHS, all health boards do. But we talk, you know, but we do talk with each other, but I don't think it's as coordinated as perhaps it could be. You know, I think we could do better there in linking people in with you know, strategy development and implementation. We often talk too late in the day, I think, is a repeated realization, which we don't manage to avoid doing the next time. Yeah.
Jodi, you're coming from an organisation with a reasonably big team. You say reasonably, you're right? So you've got a lot of people around. Do you manage to get any links in, or do you have regular conversations with the information team?
Definitely. So in terms of the majority of the projects that we have, we actually link in quite a lot with the information team so that they help us to, so for example, with our virtual wards, so all the forms that we build are built in such a way so that the data is then able to be captured by the BI team. We then will meet with them to present that information back to the clinical teams who we look after the patients for, so that we're then able to use that data to show like lengths of stay, reduce admissions and stuff like that. So, and then with the information team, they meet regularly with the CNIO as well, so like every week.
That's fantastic. So I can see that and I think this possibly this reflects the size of teams and whatever. If you've got to the stage and the maturity of having a reasonable size of a clinical informatics team, you've got those clinicians around, you've got people working in that space, then you've got the capacity and the organisation's got that maturity to start moving on and really having that joined up approach around information, which of course, we're all saying this, the point of this is to have a data-driven health and care. So you couldn't do that unless you're actually working with the information team. But sadly, sometimes you've got to, the people are being stretched a little bit and are not having time to form those relationships. Has anybody any other thoughts on that? No?
I can come in.
I guess.
Yeah, Basil, and then on about Ramandi.
I mean, I guess essentially, I think this comes down to size of your organisation. There's a like minimum level you need to do informatics work, and the bigger you are, the easier it is to fulfill that. And then the additional size tends to be around implementation and maintenance of things. And I think it's most challenging when you're small about how you integrate the two. And I suppose, again, possibly controversially, I think we're seeing that dynamic between different priorities for the use of information being played out sort of nationally. And it's probably important within your organisation to decide what your priority might be. You know, is it our day-to-day care of individual patients? Is it our operations and business intelligence? Is it the sort of public health type population data we're trying to supply or required to supply? Or is it our academic priorities? And I think you've got to, a bit like the contract stuff I mentioned, you've got to manage those tensions. Otherwise, you'll end up circling, as Steve was saying, not really achieving very much, but just arguing about who gets which bit of the pie to do the work. And ultimately, the actual data and information structures should serve all four of those. It's just about getting to that point where it's suitable for all purposes. And I have a bias, which I'm not going to go into, but about which way you go about that. And I think that's quite important because it hasn't really been optimally worked out.
Yeah,
Thanks,
super.
Basil.
Yeah.
Thanks, Basil. And to just, I think, sort of agree with Jodi and Basil on their points. I think for me, obviously, what I talked about was quite aspirational, but actually, considering where our organisation is, so from a maturity perspective, we're certainly not as digitally mature as some of the other organisations, and perhaps slightly envious, Jodi, of the team that you work in. So I think one of the things there, and I found this with our health intelligence team, and I'm sure this reflects some of our other colleagues on the call, they're very much focused on those statutory and mandatory data reporting sets. Oh, there's a lot of feedback that need to be delivered. So they don't have time to be able to do some of that really innovative work that Jodian's talked about. And I say innovative, but there may be other people on the call who go, but that's normal. Like that should be what you were saying, Anne-Marie, about data-driven care. That should be what we expect as the norm. But because they're so busy trying to do all the lots of different mandatory requirements, they don't necessarily have the capacity. And how do we therefore support that through our teams that we're trying to build, and also not inadvertently in any way de-skill people, but bring people together on that journey. Yes, I'll hand back over. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to just to say, we've got, just kind of summarising up now, we've had and Claire's posted in about the return on investment, what you get out of your team. And when we started this piece of work, we sort of said, can we do this? But to a certain extent, your clinical informatics team are a bit like, I've said, I had an emergency call there with the plumber. We bought a new house. The plumbing needs work. You don't notice your plumbing when it's doing a good job. You're just warm. You're just whatever. It's the way you expect it to be. The services work. They're not sort of, whenever things go wrong, then that's when it is. And that's what I said, in a way, we're thinking about de-risking. So whenever things go wrong and people do implementations and they don't get the benefits of the other bigger projects and things happening or mistakes going on, that's probably because they don't have them. So we started sort of saying, oh, should we try and capture some stories of what happens when you don't actually have people in place, the bad things? And that's a little bit of a negative spin on it. So instead, I think as we're going on, we want to be able to talk more about what actually the clinical informatics teams are doing and how that adds value. That's going to be into our next stage. But what we're doing here is we've got this survey out, and one of the things is we did a very small number. There's many organisations across the UK, and we want to get a better handle on what size the teams are in these and what kind of work they're doing. And that's really to help us get on to that next stage of trying to be able to say, these are the size of teams, this is what they're able to do, this is what's going on, because this is not baselined. And if it's not baselined, you're not going to be able to say, there's how it's changing, and you're not going to be able to, so we just need more data, and it won't be perfect, but it will be better, like any data, than not having it at all. So our survey is out there. Please go and join it. The webinar has been accredited, so you've got CPD point for coming along and taking part. Email there the event certificate.